All right, so today we're going to look at parts of the neuron. Okay, so this is specifically a multipolar neuron. So with these specific neurons, okay, you're going to find these all throughout the body. Okay, they have a few specific parts we're going to identify, and then we're going to discuss how each part functions to complete the task, right? So a neuron is going to be responsible for sending messages throughout the body, either from one nerve to the next, or maybe from the brain out to a specific muscle or gland or something to cause it to produce a function. So we're going to go through and label it as we kind of discuss what it is that we're labeling, okay? So we're going to start up here in the top left with the dendrites. Okay, so the dendrites are going to be what's responsible for receiving the message, either from the brain or from another neuron. They're going to pick up that message, and they're going to take it into what we're going to call the cell body. Okay. So the cell body is going to be this whole area here. Within that cell body, you find a nucleus. So we've been talking about muscle contraction. So in terms of muscle contraction, your brain sends a message. The dendrites pick up that message. They then take that message into the nucleus, where it gets processed, and through a series of different processes, it creates the vesicle, the bubble thing that we've discussed before. It creates a vesicle with acetylcholine inside of it. Okay, all that happens in and because of the nucleus. It's going to then send the message down the neuron. Okay, so where you can see the cell body start to narrow, that's called the axon hillock. It's then going to go through the axon. So the axon is going to be the long, narrow part that connects one end of this neuron to the next. At the end, down here, you have a whole bunch of what we're going to call axon terminals. So axon terminals are where we're going to see the acetylcholine, in this example, be released to the muscle. Okay? So if we go back into the axon very quickly, there's a few things I want to note. So you have these structures here that we're going to call myelin sheath. Now, I'm going to make a distinction down here at the bottom so we're clear on this. So you've got a difference between neurons found in the central nervous and neurons found in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so in the central nervous system, you may still have myelin sheath, but it's produced and created by what's called oligodendrocytes. It's a long word, but oftentimes you'll see it depicted as a structure that comes off and is connected to the myelin sheath, okay? So this here is the oligodendrocyte. It creates myelin sheath in the central nervous system. Now, you may also have myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system, okay? Those will look very similar to what you see on the screen here. That myelin sheath is produced by what's called a Schwann cell. Now, I'm going to draw this down here very quickly. So if you think about a Schwann cell, so I'm going to draw it as red. Okay, so you've got a Schwann cell. Okay, so let's just say we're taking the myelin sheath from this neuron and we're looking specifically in to the end of it. That's where I'm getting this red circle. Now, on the inside of that, it produces myelin sheath in kind of a circular formation. Now, let's talk about what I'm drawing here. So you've got the Schwann cell here, which is the part of the neuron that makes the myelin sheath. The blue part is the actual myelin itself, the myelin sheath. So that's what's wrapped around the axon. This is the axon. Okay, so I want to kind of see it in comparison to the whole picture here. So I'm taking a structure like the myelin sheath here that we've just labeled, and I'm looking in the end of it. That's where you get this picture at the bottom. So you've got the axon, what connects one end of the neuron to the other. It's wrapped with myelin sheath that is covered by a Schwann cell. So the Schwann cell produces myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. Now, let's talk about the way they function. Okay. So, very quickly, you've got a message sent, let's say, from your frontal lobe that tells your arm to move. That message is sent and picked up by the dendrites. The dendrites send that message down toward the cell body, specifically to the nucleus. In the nucleus, it runs through a series of processes with the DNA and the RNA and the ribosomes and all these different parts. It's going to create a vesicle, okay, which is that bubble kind of thing, that's filled with acetylcholine. Now, once that vesicle is created, there's another protein that's going to be responsible for taking it down the axon. Okay, so it's going to go down the axon toward the end. When we get down to the end, that vesicle is going to shift all the way down to the very end of the axon terminal. Now, when we get to the end of the axon terminal, okay, this whole time, we've been depolarizing the neuron. Okay, so remember, the way we do that, I'm going to depict in red so we can see it different. You've got sodium coming in. So your body starts to send in the sodium to depolarize this neuron. Okay, and it happens all the way down the neuron. Because the sodium is essential when we get to the end. Because when you get to the very end of the axon terminal, you're going to have calcium come in. And that calcium, if you remember from last semester, is going to be responsible for causing the vesicles to shift all the way to the very end of the axon terminal, okay, and release out the acetylcholine. So real quick, you've got the dendrite picks up the signal, it takes it into the nucleus, it gets processed, and the vesicle is created. It sends the vesicle down to the end, where the depolarized neuron will then release the acetylcholine out to the muscle. And then the muscle, we know, continues the process and leads to muscle contraction. But this is how each part is responsible for doing that. Now, you have a gap here between the myelin sheath that we've called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, the nodes of Ranvier are going to be essentially just the space between the myelin sheath. But what's important about it is that instead of having to send sodium through channels all throughout the whole neuron, we're able to send it in channels just within these nodes of Ranvier. Okay, and it actually takes the speed of the transmission, how fast we send the message, and it increases it tremendously. So keep in mind that the myelin sheath, specifically with the nodes of Rambier, increase the speed of transmission because we're able to bypass the sections where the myelin sheath are and only depolarize through the channels in the nodes of Rambier. So keep in mind that we need to know not only the parts of it, but I want you to see it kind of with this example of muscle contraction on how we go from picking up that signal in the dendrites all the way to releasing the acetylcholine at the end of the axon terminal, and see how that process can be applied to different things outside of just muscle contraction, but being able to explain how each part of the neuron functions together to complete a task. Now, we're going to look at one more part of this. So far we've talked about just the anatomy of a neuron and how it works. Now we're going to apply that concept or that idea to something that we're going to call the reflex arc. Okay, so in this example, a reflex occurs quicker than a normal planned out response, right? So in this example, we've got two different things we want to focus on first. The motor neuron, okay, so when you hear the word motor, I want you to think movement, because motor neurons are going to be what causes muscles to contract and it leads to movement, okay? When you hear sensory, think the five senses, okay? Touch, smell, sight, five senses. So as you look at these two things in relationship to one another, we're going to take something like the receptors of the skin, the top left part of the screen. When you get poked by a pen or touched by something, the pen is going to be picked up, or that pain is going to be picked up by those receptors, and it's going to send the pain, or send the message, through the sensory neuron back towards the spinal cord, okay? So this whole structure here is the spinal cord. So you've got a sensory neuron over here that's going to be taking that message toward the central nervous system. So that's an important point. So when you think sensory neuron, think toward central nervous system. Okay? When you hear motor neuron, okay, I want you to think away from the central nervous system. Now remember, central nervous is going to be brain and spinal cord. So let's come back to our example. You've got a pin that pricks the skin. That message gets sent from the skin in the receptors towards the spinal cord, where you're going to notice there's a different neuron here that we have not discussed. It's called the interneuron. Now, normally, in a normal planned out response, you would have the sensory neuron send that message to the spinal cord. It goes to the brain, gets processed, and gets sent back down and back out to the muscle. Okay, so down here, I'm just going to write it as N. So normal response is sensory neuron sends a message to the spinal cord, then to the brain, back down the spinal cord, and then out through the motor neuron to the muscle. Okay, so that's normal. In the reflex arc, we're just going to abbreviate as RA, reflex arc, you're going to go sensory neuron to spinal cord, through the interneuron to the motor neuron to the muscle. So what you'll notice here is you're skipping this step. So this part right here, the brain, is being skipped by this interneuron. So coming back to our example, we pick up the sensation of the pin poking the skin. It goes back through the sensory neuron. It's then going to go through this interneuron into the motor neuron out to the muscle. So when you think reflex or reflex arc, I want your mind to go straight to interneurons because that's what bridges the gap between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. Okay, so just to recap, this is a reflex arc. The quickness of the reflex is because you have interneurons that allow you to bypass the brain. Okay, so if you look back down here at the bottom, you can see that normal versus reflex arc kind of sequence, and you can see that the brain is being skipped, which is what increases the speed of the transmission and of the response itself.